I am delighted to introduce Eldar Shaffir. He's our keynote speaker for the evening. He's the class of 1987 Professor of Behavioral Science and Public Policy. Also, the inaugural director of Princeton's Kahneman-Treisman Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy, and co-founder and scientific director at Ideas 42, which is a social science R&D lab. Professor Shaffir studies decision-making, cognitive science, and behavioral economics. His recent work, in fact, I think just today, he came from Washington, where he's been looking at decision-making in the context of poverty and the application of behavioral research to policy. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Council. He has received several awards, most recently a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he was one of Foreign Policy Magazine's 100 Leading Global Thinkers. He earned his BA from Brown and his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes, then take some Q&A. So please welcome our speaker.
Thank you. It's great to be here in this beautiful, beautiful room. I'll try to make it in 20 minutes. It might take up to half an hour. They told me it would be fine. So with Olivia's permission, I warned her ahead of time. This is not about Fin and it's not about tech. This is really my attempt to give you my version of Psych 101 Express. It's kind of what I think people who are interested in behavior should know about behavior that we teach in policy circles. Of course, I'll try to touch on issues that have to do more with finance, but my interest is really to come from left field for you and give you some sense of how we in the social sciences think about behavior and its implications and importance for things, hopefully, that you do. So I always like to do my story, and then we'll talk about how it might be relevant to you, and hopefully you'll see it in some cases. So I want to focus on three things that I think today when we teach behavioral science are the main ones. So it's context, construal, and capacity. The first one is basically the situation matters much more than we appreciate. The second is that we construe, represent things in our own ways, often not the way they are in the world or how somebody else assumes they might be. And capacity is just how we underestimate what we're able to do at any one time, basically our very limited bandwidth that drives what we do. And I think all these are very relevant to some of the things that you are trying to do as you help people think about their pensions and savings, et cetera. So when you talk about context, there's many places to start. I just am incapable to start anywhere other than these series of very classical studies. You will have seen some of them that have entered sort of popular culture, but I want to give you my 2 minutes of them. These are European psychologists who come to the US after the Second World War, sort of obsessed with understanding the German mind. Of course, we know now there's nothing German about it. But at the time, it's remarkable how little we understood. And so, again, you've seen some of these as a classic study that Stanley Milgram does at the basement of the psych department at Yale. He has middle-aged men come to participate in the study. They think they're being randomly assigned to teachers and students, but in fact, all the subjects, this is a guy in a black suit, will be teachers. The student, the one who's attached to electrodes sitting down in the white shirt, is a Confederate, is an actor. He's Confederate working for the experimenter. The experimenter introduces them, then the subject, the teacher, goes to the other side of the partition, and it's a paired associate test. The task is sort of irrelevant, but the idea is that I teach you paired associates like house, banana. Later, when I say house, the student's supposed to say banana. If he says banana, bravo, we move on. If he makes a mistake, you give him a slight electric shock. And this is carefully coordinated. Every time you give a shock, the lever stays down, so you know where you last were. And then you move progressively to the right, going up and up in the voltage that you're presumably giving this person. As you can see here, at certain voltage, there are grunts. At 150, he screams, "Get me out of here. I told you I have heart trouble," which he happens to mention when they first meet. At 270, there are massive screams of agony. The original tapes are available if you want to see them on PBS. And if you choose to go on at 3:30, after he screamed bloody murder and told you that he has heart trouble, if you choose to go on at 3:30, you say house, and nothing comes back. 340, 350, 360, 370, up to 450. You ask 12 or 13 questions if you chose to do so, with no noise comes back. Now, why would anybody want to do any of this? Well, the only pressure that's on you is this distinguished fellow who looks like he knows what he's doing in a white robe being paid by Yale University, who insists that it's important the experiment to continue, you must go on, et cetera. That's the only pressure. You can see a little bit of a close-up. It goes to XXX, danger, et cetera. Now, what made Milgram a particularly good researcher is he also went and asked people he gave them a full rendition of the study, in much more detail than I just gave you, and asked them to predict what will people do. So we have the data. We know that in early 1970s, Northeast USA, everybody predicts disobedience. The average prediction is when the grunts get sort of loud, the prediction is the person will refuse to continue. Nobody predicts anybody will go above 300, except for the psychiatrists, the experts on human behavior in the Northeast, who recognize that 1 in 1,000 will be a sociopath who will go up to 450. Those are the predictions. What Milgram finds is that 65% are sociopaths, and everybody goes above 300. Now, we can spend a lot of time to talk about this. We know for a fact, this is a discovery about human behavior that we did not know. The experts in human behavior did not know 50 years ago. That's number one. We also know that we don't get it. So most people in this room suspect they wouldn't do it, and most people in this room are profoundly wrong, and we just can't understand it. We also know this because if you ask people who have taken courses to read the article about Abu Ghraib and tell you about the soldiers, they think they're terrible people, not wonderful people in a bad situation that we put them in. It's just very hard. And so for me, the number one insight from the social sciences in the last 40, 50 years is how powerful the situation is and how we tend not to get it. We underestimate it. The reason it becomes interesting, of course, is because you don't have to electrocute people to have this happen. It happens in how you design offices, how you design classrooms, how you design a website, how you arrange a dinner. The outcomes are often less dramatic, but the effects on behavior are profound in ways that we don't appreciate. This is sort of a personal story, but I think all of you will find it. So when I took a course on computer science at some point when I was in Cambridge, and there was a class about local optimization. And at some point, I just realized that after I moved to Cambridge, I would leave home every day and walk toward my office at MIT. There was a very strange garage on Amherst Street. And when I got to it, it felt like left was going forward and right was going backwards, and I took a left. When I came home at the end of the day, I hit this garage. Left felt like it was going forward. Right felt like it was going backwards. I took a left. And for 3 years, every day I walked opposite routes, to and from. There was no uphill, there was no downhill, there was nothing. And if you check the map carefully, I was sub-optimizing about 300 yards, one way as opposed to the other. And I think it's a nice example because the economist thinks that when I moved to Cambridge, I look at a map, I find the shortest route, and I proceed to take it with a will of steel every day. Whereas people they do something quite reasonable. They get to a point, and looks reasonable to have some money in savings. And then they get to a point that looks reasonable to take some money on a credit card, and everything looks reasonable, put it together, something terrible is going on. And this is the kind of thing we see again and again, where the decisions are not dumb, they're just very local. And globally, you haven't configured something out. And in a sense, to me, many of us are in this business of designing these local optima in ways that send people in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. So this is a classic example. If you see it well, this is contextual design par excellence. It also captures, intention versus action very nice. So I plan to diet, I plan to save for retirement, I plan to eat well, and then somebody puts this escalator, and everything goes wrong. Now, it turns out if you're in North Korea, you can do this, but in America, you can't. In America, you can't really do this, so we have to find more subtle ways to send people in the right direction. Now, if you look at something like Fafsa, for example, to me, that's still a contextual design issue. So I assume many of you know this story. This is Nick Filariopoulos and some of his collaborators. Fafsa is one of the most generous benefits we give in America today. It's many, many thousands of dollars to go to college for low-income people. Take-up of Fafsa is about a third of eligibles. The form looks like this. Somewhere, of course, they remind you that you're answering under the penalty of perjury, et cetera. And so they did a study where they look at people, and the question is, maybe people just don't know. So they go to people, they said to them, I know everything about your finance, your parents' income, you're eligible for Fafsa, here's the form. And if you look, the purple is the original, and the green is what happens when you do this, nothing happens. So I told you everything, and you know everything, and nothing happens. Version number 3, I know everything about you, I know your parents' income, I know your income, here's the form, let's fill it out together. And actual matriculation in college goes up 25%. And this is somebody at minimum wage spending an hour with you filling out a form. Much cheaper than things we've tried before. It's, in some sense, it's a nudge. It's an architectural nuance. But things like these end up being very, very formative in some situations if we understand what it is that's stopping the person from doing something that otherwise they seem like they might want to do. Olivia mentioned, I do a lot of work in poverty these days. The poor behave terribly in all elements of life. And if you look at the context that they inhabit, and you take it seriously, it's really not surprising. So poverty is a place where almost all bad things meet. Everything from noise and crime to disrespect and lack of sleep and everything else. And again, the point is that you look at it and you sort of understand it, but you just don't understand it enough. I'll give you a quote. This is a quote that comes from a recent book. It's kind of remarkable. So General Patton has the, I don't know if the honor or the misfortune to be the first American soldier to enter the gates of the concentration camps. And he encounters people who don't look so good. He's a talented man, and here is what he thinks. This is Luckbaugh who describes this in a book. He just can't discount enough for the fact that he knows these people just spent 3 years in hell. They still look to him like they're disgusting and incompetent. And this is deep. It's deep because when you look at the poor, they don't look as bad as the concentration camps, but it's very hard for us to see the person and say, it's literally me if I didn't sleep and had noise and I didn't have money to finish the month and had 100 kids at home. It's very hard for us to do. So this is a little bit of the power of the situation, and it's going to have big impact on the people you try to help and the situations they're in before or after you intervene in ways that we can discuss. Part of Patton's problem is what we call construal, which is it's not what's out there, it's what you see. And this is, I always try to emphasize, this is the most trivial claim I will ever make, but somehow we've created a world where it ends up being profound, which is, when you make a choice between 2 jobs or 2 cars or 2 houses, you're not choosing between those things in the world. You're choosing between those things as they are represented in the 3-pound machine that you carry behind the eyes and between the ears. It's obvious, but it's profoundly important, because if you think about what we do very often in our models, is we assume the person is deciding between the things that are out there. And of course they're not. And a lot of the work in behavioral economics, if you look at framing, it's all about the fact that I give you the same stuff and I lead you to represent it in slightly different, you construe it in slightly different ways with an enormous impact. And this could be, amusing or more serious. This is a study that I love. This is a question of, is it worth investing in driving a Bmw to work every day rather than a Ford Escort? Perfectly reasonable question. So if you ask people, I'm skipping different stages here. If you ask people while they're driving, after they're driving, it doesn't really matter. What are you driving and how is the commute today? Turns out that BMWs make you much happier than Escorts or Hondas. But now, instead of asking them, what are you driving and how's the commute, you do something slightly different. You call them and say, how's the commute today? And by the way, what are you driving? And now there's no difference at all. So it turns out, if I'm thinking about the fact that I'm driving a BMW, it's a much nicer ride. If I'm thinking about something else, it's the exact same ride, whatever car I'm driving. Now, notice it's kind of interesting. Clearly, if you're BMW, what you ought to do is install a little gadget that every 30 seconds says you're driving a BMW. But apart from that, there's a really interesting, you really have to ask yourself, will I be thinking about the car I'm driving every day, and is it worth the money? Because that answer resides in how you experience it mentally, not in the car, basically. And again, this is not surprising if you look at visual illusions. I hope it works well for you. If this works well for you, if I ask you about the 3 cars in 2D, forget the 3D cues. Just look at these cars on the screen. I hope you don't believe me that the top and the bottom are exactly the same size on the screen. Olivia at least doesn't believe me. It makes me feel better. Now, all I can do, I can actually bring you up here with a ruler, but what I'll do instead, you should believe me, I'm going to take a line and simply cut and paste it 3 times. So this line is the same line, and it's the exact same size. Now, if you do this in really good conditions, by the way, if you put people in perfect visual conditions, and you put the line on the bottom car and then move it to the top, because your visual system refuses to admit they're the same size, you actually experience the line contracting and expanding as it moves from one car to the other, rather than believe it. But the point, again, is we've all seen this before. So the point is that there is something in the world that's not the experience I'm having. I'm construing something different from what's out there. And that's going to be true for many things in everyday life. Again, I'm interested in some of the issues around poverty. I'll give you just one example for fun of sorts. It's something we did recently. Here is a person. Here is the exact same person with clothes that independent judges agree are richer. So here he's poor, here he's rich. This is not about race. You can have whites and blacks. In this case, social class trumps race. Here is a person, here he's rich, here he's poor. I don't even know what makes poor rich. These are just done by judges. It turns out after the fact that Hawaiian shirts make you look poor, by the way, in case you care. But all we do is show you these faces and ask you, how competent is this person? It's the only question you get. You see a face. You only see, of course, one shirt or the other. You see a face. How competent is this face? We are extremely efficient face perceivers. It doesn't take you very long. These are judgments made in 1 second. If you're watching a face for a second, you're so good at it, it actually gets sort of boring. But here is half a second. 70 milliseconds is you sort of think you saw a face. And notice that 70 seconds is enough to predict how you'll feel about this person's competence at 1 second. And now we're going to show the exact same face when he's wearing a richer shirt, and this is highly significant. So in 100 milliseconds of seeing somebody in the street and Starbucks is enough to determine how competent they are based on slightly richer or poorer clothing before you've done anything else. Okay? This is one of the findings that have made me sad recently, because it shows that HBS is right when they tell you to dress well for interviews, but that's life. And this has interesting implications. Interesting implications for other issues. So, for example, with a lot of things like this we can look at. But if you simply look at people's perception of who's better off, it turns out that we have a bunch of these studies. People who are positive net worth, it's nice to have very little debt. Okay, so basically, when you get rid of your mortgage, which financially might not be the best thing, you feel better because you went down on your debt. If you're in the red, it's good to have assets. So borrowing a lot of money, which might not be the best thing, makes you feel better than not having any when you're in the red. Now, clearly we can discuss the financial implications of many of these decisions, but the psychology here is interesting. When people have positive value, debt makes you feel less good. When they have negative value, assets make you feel better. And it can go for extreme. So in a case like this, for example, we can see here is that having no debt makes you feel better even though your net worth is lower. And in this case, having assets make you feel better although your net worth is lower. So these are cases where, again, you take financial steps which we might consider a mistake, but it becomes philosophically interesting if it's fiscally a mistake, but it makes me feel better when I get up in the morning or go to sleep at night. And this, by the way, like I said, the poor behave terribly on many financial issues. It's infinite the number of mistakes they make. We can talk more if you feel like it later about payday loans, which there's a lot to talk about. And the mistake that the poor make on payday loans are of the sort that I can try to convince you I can create in my students at Princeton as well. It's not about being myopic, it's being in a situation that makes you feel myopic. It's a different story. But talking about this, here's a classic scenario you get when you look at the finances of the poor. So my colleague Kathy Eden has documented some of these. You take a single mother who has a debt on 4 credit cards. It's a classic case. And she can't pay them all, so she pays 3 this month. And when you look, you say, that's interesting, because the one you didn't pay has higher interest rate than the ones you paid. Looks like a mistake. All of us would judge that as a mistake. And she says, oh, yes, of course I understand that, but these schmucks called me last week and they insulted me and I'm not paying them. Now, think about this. All of us will be willing to incur a cost to punish a schmuck. There's nothing a mistake in it. It's something that a pure finance person might consider not legitimate. But part of mental life is of this sort. And I think that when we think about how to make people do the right things, those aspects of mental life, which do not enter the finance manual, might have an enormous impact that I'm not sure we need to respect, but we need at least to take into account when we think about them. So, and again, the claim here is that many situations that we look at, what people remember from their experiences, how they construe their experiences, a lot of it is mental life that has a logic of its own and doesn't always jive with standard financial calculations. Since this is dinner, I thought I'd bring a couple of very amusing studies. This is a study that Richard Thaler and I ran a few years ago. We were flying somewhere from Chicago to San Francisco or something. And Dick is a fancy guy, and he had all these coupons for upgrades to first class, and I didn't. So he said, you take one of mine, and we'll fly together. So he pulls out these coupons, and it turns out some of them he had bought for like $100, and some the airline sent them for free. Now, they're identical now, but we looked, and we both cracked up because we knew that if he gave me the one that he paid $100 for, I would insist on paying back. And if he gave me the one he got for free, I'd consider him horrible if he asked me for a cent. But the identical, the replacement is identical. And that's when we decided to test this, and in fact, subjects feel the way I did. But then we did this. This is a group of extremely fancy wine collectors. Orly Ashenfelter, an economist at Princeton, runs a newsletter about wine. These are all very, very well-to-do, educated, rich people who subscribe to this very expensive wine newsletter. And we ran them, and what we said is, look, you bought a bottle years back in the futures market. You paid $20 a bottle. Now this bottle is worth $75 in the store. Now you open and drink it. How much does it feel it's worth to you? It's costing you to drink this bottle. It's a question that you ought to have some sense of. This is kind of normal. One option is drinking the bottle doesn't feel like it costs me anything. I've had it for a very long time, and it's mine now. Another one, it feels like it costs me $20, which is what I paid for it originally. It feels like it costs me $20 plus interest, which is what I would have had I not bought it. It feels like it costs me $75, what it would cost to replace it today. Or my favorite is I'm drinking this one. I'm saving lots of money because I'm drinking expensive wine and I paid only a little. Okay, so what do people do? These are, again, very highly educated people. They don't know how to think about it. So a third are actually, well, a quarter are making money drinking expensive wine for which they paid only a little. And if you look, this is the only, quote, correct answer, replacement cost, and it's less than a fifth. Now, apropos mental life, you take this bottle, instead of drinking it, you just happen to drop it and break it. And now more than half feel that it's replacement cost. Okay? Now, well, how human, not weird, yeah. But you see, it comes really centrally into how we valued experiences that, from another perspective, are completely exchangeable. And my last one is on cognitive capacity. Senil Mulanathan and I wrote a book on scarcity where we talk a lot about the cognitive limitations that happen when people juggle poverty. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but first of all, if you haven't followed, there's a whole set of issues now around the use of cell phones in cars. It's a beautiful story because there are several states now where it's illegal to use handheld phones, and it's only because it's the only thing you can sell the American public. Anybody in this business knows that hands are irrelevant. It's your head that's the problem. So when they put people in simulators on a phone, no hands held, your reaction time and your ability to detect the periphery compared to somebody who's legally drunk on American roads. And and I say this to you, and you and I will all get in the car and get on the phone because we think we can beat it. It's one of those things we just don't appreciate. We describe a study in our book about, these are sociologists who found a school in Connecticut that by random happenstance, half the kids are assigned to a quiet side of the school, and the other half are near a window where trains go by. I'm sorry, what did I do here? I'm trying to go back, yeah. For half of them, a train goes out the window, past outside the window occasionally during the day. Now, are trains distracting outside the window? Sure, they're distracting. How distracting are they? They discovered that in 5th grade, the kids near the train side of the school are 1 year behind in academic performance. That's a massive effect. They install soundproofing, the kids catch up, and the point that we tell, at least in the context of poverty, but it doesn't have to be the poor, is imagine yourself now in a totally quiet room, no trains, and you have some major preoccupation. You left a sick child at home, you had a major fight with your partner. Those are internal trains. They're gonna impact your performance just like the trains outside the window for the kids. They have beautiful studies where they have people, basically the series of studies where what we do is basically have this half of the room I ask, please remember 2 digits for me, 17. Don't forget 17. This half I ask, please remember 7 digits, 17256224. While you're doing this, the group that's busy remembering 7 eats less well, is much more likely to forget to call their mother on her birthday, is less likely to notice a dude on a unicycle dressed as a clown. Your head is busy. And again, in the context of poverty, we talk about the fact that the poor are walking on a lot of the time maintaining 7 digits. For the rest of us, there are good days and bad days, but the impact on what happens when you're busy, on your capacity, your intelligence at a meeting, is underappreciated. And so we do a lot of work, I'm not gonna go through all this, but we talk about how the poor at least tunnel on what matters right now. And when they tunnel on what matters right now, there is less mind left for other things. The classic studies that we did, I'll just tell you these are done in a mall somewhere in New Jersey. We ask people to participate in the study, they agree, they sit in front of a computer, they get scenarios of financial challenges, very much like everyday life, so your car breaks down, it's gonna cost X dollars to fix. The scenarios come in 2 versions called the manageable and challenging. In a manageable case, the car is gonna cost you $150 to fix, which we know for most people in the mall is manageable. In a challenging case, the car is gonna cost you $1,500 to fix, which we know for about half of America is a major challenge. So as you're thinking about this, just to make things interesting, we'll let you play certain games. There are cognitive tests of divided attention and IQ. And then we'll look at how you do. I'm doing this quickly, so forgive me. If you look at cognitive control, that's basically a divided attention test, how well you drive, basically. If the 2 left bars, the green and orange, are the rich. We divide people by household income into rich and poor. They don't care which car they're fixing. Whether they're fixing the $1,500 or the $150 car, they perform just as well. The poor in the mall, when they're worried about fixing the $150 car, perform just like the rich friends. But when they're preoccupied with trying to figure out how to take care of the $1,500 car, they drive less well. The cognitive attention diminishes, the divided attention goes down. Same for fluid intelligence. The rich don't care. The poor are statistically identical to the rich on the easy car, but they lose a lot of fluid intelligence. This is exactly what you would get if I gave you these tests while I asked you to retain the 7 digits. If you maintain those 7 digits I gave you, you would do significantly less well in fluid intelligence tests, which is what we find these low-income people showing when they're fixing the challenging car. This effect is a Cohen's d of 0.9. It's near a standard deviation. If you take standard assumptions about the IQ tests, the guys who were just as good as their rich friends a minute ago are now functioning at about 12 to 13 IQ points lower. 12 to 13 IQ points in a school. My kids go to school on a qualitative scale is enough to take you from average to borderline gifted or from average to borderline deficient. It's a big effect. We know from other studies, not ours, if I kept you last night up all night with Rolling Stones blasting in the background, you would be 9 IQ points less intelligent today. So imagine, how that feels. These guys with these problems are feeling worse than that. It's a very big effect. Here we have other cases where we invite them to get lost in a screen, have their mind wander, watching beautiful scenes of beaches and forests. What we find is if you do a word identification task, the rich, when they're getting their mind wander on a beach or in a forest, identify beach-related and word-related words faster than otherwise. The poor don't. They just can't get their minds lost in the forest. They still identify money faster than tree, but I won't get into the details. And this is happening, in contexts that are relevant to you too. This is a nice study where this is a Stroop test. So I don't know if you've seen these before. Your task here is simply to name the color in which the word appears. So you get these quickly on the screen, and the answers are red and blue. And what you find is that people who have been selected for having financial worries take significantly longer to say red compared to blue as opposed to controls. So you're trying to say red, but retirement is distracting. And that's kind of what happens with a lot of low-income people in many cases. And all of these situations are situations where basically you have very limited bandwidth, and that bandwidth is now taken by preoccupation about finances, about retirement, about food with a lot of beautiful work about the hungry. Dieting, by the way, reduces your IQ, just so you know. These are all the cases where your distractions actually take a significant amount of your cognitive capacity. And when you have clients or people with limited cognitive capacity, it has implications not just on how they perform, but for example, on messaging. How do you influence people? There's a lot of beautiful work on how I try to influence your behavior. If I want to influence you to do something, there's a continuum, but take two extremes. I can either get you through your central processor. I need you to stop doing everything you're doing, listen to me, weigh the arguments I'm presenting, and decide if you believe the conclusions. I need your full logical reasoning. Alternatively, the other side of the extreme is I have you very busy doing other stuff. I put a picture of, Coca-Cola on the wall, and it's totally peripheral, and you don't even know you saw it, and you leave the room and you have an urge for a Coke. So it's central, and there is peripheral. Now, here's an interesting fact. Take somebody who's cognitively busy. What's the picture you put on the wall that gives them the urge to save for retirement? Nobody has found one. So when you look at what it takes, you basically have to stop everything you're doing and get a master's degree before you know how to save for retirement. Compare that, for example, if I wanted to convince you to smoke. I don't want your central processor. I don't want you to pay attention because you have 1,000 arguments why it's stupid. I want you to be very, very busy doing other stuff, and I'm going to put posters of beautiful people, Italian villas, a few guns since we're in the US, and I'll give you the urge to smoke. Very different. And so the messages you can get to people who are preoccupied and have limited bandwidth are very different. And the peripheral messages, there's a reason why Vanity Fair, the first 30 pages are just glossy pictures of beautiful people doing nothing. It works. Now, how well it works, we don't always know. We did one study. I'll finish with this just to tell you. This is a study we did with a money lender in South Africa. This is predatory money lending world. It's a money lender in South Africa. We can discuss how come they let us do this. I still don't understand because it cost them a lot of money. But we sent a letter inviting people to apply for a loan. All the recipients of this letter had taken a loan from this lender at least once, an average of 5 times. And what we do is we manipulate certain things. The most important thing is we manipulate the interest rate on this loan between 3 and 12 percentage points monthly at increments of 0.25%. So you might get 6 1/4, you might get 8 1/2, anywhere between 3 and 12. If you're worried about the ethics of it, everybody in this world is getting higher interest rates. So here, everybody's getting a gift, but some much bigger than others. By random assignment, you're getting some interest rate between 3 and 12, but then we'll manipulate other stuff. So for example, if you look here, there's a sort of a complicated table that's simply showing you examples of different loans you can take. It's just information. But people don't really like very complicated tables, so some by random assignment get just one example. Just a simpler sheet, one example instead of 4. If you look here at the bottom, there's a very nice dude smiling. Others get a dudette, and others get nothing at all. Now, all these things are crossed. These are 52,000 letters sent. Everything is crossed. And so you can intuit how we can basically ask, does interest make a difference? And does it make a difference if I switch a picture from a man to a woman, and how much relative to percentage interest? So we can actually ask here in this really contrived setting, what difference does it make when I do these things? I'm skipping many things, but just to give you some examples, when you make the table simpler, just give people less information, take-up goes up the equivalent of lowering interest 2.3 percentage points monthly. I should have said, economics is right. When you lower interest, take-up goes up. But then you get this. You also get, when I change this dude to the dudette, take-up goes up the equivalent of lowering interest 3.2 percentage points monthly. That's the amount of money people are paying for a little picture on a piece of paper they're about to put in the garbage. And that's peripheral advertising. And that has an enormous impact. And we can talk more about this, but in the world of policy today, there's a really complicated story here because A lot of low ball players play this game massively, and those who respect people too much don't do it, and they're hurting people. In Trenton, is close to where I live, you can get a fairly good mortgage from community organizers and providers who sit in little shabby offices with formica tables at Peel, or you can get one from somebody who comes to you with balloons and teddy bears, and guess what you get? And this is a fight that's complicated because by respecting people too much to shape their preference, will leave them prey to people who do it quite well. Anyway, to conclude, it's an old quote. People have used it before, but it's a very nice way of saying, if what you do depends on how people behave, it's important that you understand how people behave, because otherwise you make things up, and it can be bad psychology. I have a giant collection of bad psychologies. I can give you a couple of examples if it's of interest, but it's very easy to make mistakes that actually hurt people when we try to help them, and vice versa. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you.
So much. That was a real eye-opening set of discussions. So I'd like to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions, ask Professor Shaffir bad psychology or anything else that you would like to raise. Go ahead and remind us who you are.
In the case with the samples of questions in the mall, when people were preoccupied with the amount of loan, that was just pretend you had it was going to cost 150 or 1,500, yet it still occupied people. I'm surprised by that sort of a hypothetical thing like that would so affect their cognitive processing. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
I'm with you. So we've replicated this a number of times. You know, there's about 4 or 5 scenarios that are made to sound and look very much like everyday experience that we can assume these people are having. You get a 5% cut in salary, your car breaks down, things that even if you're not imagining it totally well, is associated with memories you have or fears that you have. But I'm with you. The fact that this relatively hypothetical was enough to influence them this way. Again, the only thing that helps here is, imagine if I asked you to keep 6 digits in your head. It's not that dramatic. And so I think part of what happens here, which makes it counterintuitive to us, is it doesn't take that much thinking to influence these behaviors. But I totally agree that it's remarkable. The first few times I got it, I thought it was too strong.
Josh Kaplan. I'm curious if there is an effect from devaluing the authority figure, warning people about, I'm thinking back to the Milgram experiment.
Milgram, yeah.
And the question is if you prep people by some kind of delegitimizing of authority, do they act less responsively?
Yeah, I mean, your question preempts and predicts the right answer, which is yes. So, for example, if the experimenter is on the phone, this is actually Milgram tried. Instead of in the room, easy to say forget it. So these are very nuanced things. I should say, and this is critical for the study, the guys who are giving the shocks, you can see the originals, are miserable. Don't have the image of indifferent brutes. They literally are crying. They itch like you remember seeing monkeys do. They get up and beg and sit down and keep doing it. So, and this is deep because it's not that you happen to find, real psychopaths. These are lovely people who you put in a situation where all of a sudden you cannot believe what they're doing. Abu Ghraib B. But anyway, and this is a critical question, and it's part of the story. The reason the context is so important is because if it's a phone instead of a present, or if you see one person object, you have much more courage than before. A lot of research around this. You can't do this anymore, of course, today. So there's a few things that Milgram tried then, and now we do, semi-like replications, but we know that these nuances make a big difference. Yes.
Go ahead.
These 6 digits in your head reminds me of having to take, say, a luminosity brain teaser tests. I'm wondering if that might make you feel pretty depressed and maybe get you a little bit uh, you know, preoccupied while you're trying to, in fact, do something healthy.
You, I mean, the person who takes the luminosity test?
Yeah,
Yeah. It's a very
something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, look, the whole idea of training, you can train people to do amazing things. You cannot increase your working capacity. At least nobody knows how. You can lower the demand. So, you know, when you started driving, you couldn't do anything else. Now, of course, it's an automatic pilot. It doesn't require any more of this working capacity bandwidth you have. But the bandwidth itself, we can't really increase. I mean, it goes back to old work, you know, 7 plus or minus 2 that cognitive psychologists did in the 50s. But you can just become more efficient. The bandwidth thing, by the way, I should say, if you're into policy at least, and policy evaluation, has a really interesting implication. Think today if we produce a financial instrument that helps people with their banking. What do we do typically? The Treasury introduces this financial instrument, waits 2 years, and goes and evaluates how people are doing in their financial lives. Now think about it. This bandwidth I'm talking about, this real limited bandwidth we have, is the one I use to do my finances, help my kids with their homework, remember to eat healthy, pay my bills, everything else. Now, when you have given me an instrument that makes my finances easier, a very reasonable thing for me to say is, thank you so much. Now I have to devote less of this limited capacity to finances. I can spend more time with my kids' homework. But that predicts that when Treasury gives me this instrument, when they come 2 years later, they should check not my financial health, but my kids' grades. And we don't think this way. It really changes how you think about evaluating interventions with a very limited capacity actor.
Let me, if I could, take the prerogative just to ask a question, which is, that view is very pessimistic of the potential for financial education and financial literacy, in the sense that you're saying, to reinterpret, that the capacity is limited and there's no real reason or no point to try to educate people to make better decisions. But I think we have some evidence to the contrary. So how do you factor that in?
Okay, so we've talked about this before. I'm a pessimist about financial education, but for very different reasons. Look, what I'm able to do, a little bit of it is my bandwidth right now, and the rest of it is long-term memory, things we know. There's a lot of experts in this room who know a lot more than what enters your working memory right now. So if you teach me, you know, quantum mechanics, I don't have to think about it this way I do 7 digits. It's somewhere else and I retrieve it. So I think instilling knowledge in people does make them able to do better and be more sophisticated, and I think that's not a pessimistic view. Where I'm pessimistic is a slightly different notion, which is the following. Imagine I give you swimming 101. You didn't know how to swim before, and I give you a semester of swimming lessons. And then I toss you into a massively stormy ocean. 1, you'll drown. 2, I want to know how much you learned. What I need to do after a semester of teaching you swimming is to throw you into a little calm Geneva lake. What worries me about financial literacy, at least in the US, we'll see what happens in Rome, is that when you take the American poor and teach them financial literacy and toss them into the massively unregulated, cruel financial American system, they drown. And we do have data for this. You know, all the Lynch et al. Stuff, it doesn't seem, they answer questions better, but they don't seem to do that much better in their lives. And so that, I think, is a real concern.
So on the topic of nudge, which is quite popular, I'm troubled by it, and if I could share my trouble with you, which is we're trusting the nudger. So how do you reconcile, you know, people independently making decisions versus being nudged to do the right thing? If the nudging, let's say, is directed by some AI algorithm, talking about fintech here, that is nudging towards profitability for somebody or some nefarious motive. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Look, I don't have anything original to say. If you read Nudge and the arguments around it, they're pretty clear. I share your concern, but I'm not sure what alternative you have in mind. I don't trust the person who heads the Treasury Department to have good insight, necessarily. I certainly don't trust the person who runs the World Bank. I mean, every expert we hire, whether it's a nudger or a not nudger, could make mistakes or do things well. Nudging is just another instrument. You know, if we had a lecture on material science, and I produced a material that really helps treat heart operations, and you said, well, it could also be used to produce missiles, I'd say it's too bad. I hope they use it for heart operations. And so in some sense, I think nudging is an instrument like everything else we do, that if it falls in the right hands, in a careful hands, in a modest hands, could do a lot of good. And if you want to use it for bad, I think there's a lot of bad being done by people who are expert in nudging before nudge became popular in government. Again, I think in some sense, the used car salesman stereotype, poor them, people who have a lot of insight into how you shape your behavior with bad intentions long ago. But look, I'm not dismissing what you're saying. There's no doubt that any new instrument, once you have power, it could be risky. When I was in graduate school, Kurt Vonnegut came to campus and gave a classic magnificent talk, and at the end, he proposed that every graduate student, in fact, why not undergraduates, sign a Hippocratic oath, why only doctors? I thought it was completely brilliant. I have no idea why we haven't done it. But anybody who goes into a business school or a chemistry department or anywhere else should sign a Hippocratic oath. And everything we do, hopefully they'll use for good rather than bad.
So isn't that why we have IRBs? Anyway, go ahead.
So I want to ask a question about something that's always bothered me, but sort of from the angle of limited capacity or bandwidth. And I know, oftentimes, the way I express my dissatisfaction with the place we've gotten with the retirement system in the United States is asking a question. If I get sick, do I go to the doctor or do I go to medical school? And our retirement system, the answer is you have to go to medical school. You have to, and I think it's good that people learn financial literacy up to a point, but modern society and civilization in general is built on specialization, and maybe it's because of capacity limits. You have, if I have a toilet, I don't have to be a plumber, but I have to be able to have a plumber come fix it if I have a problem. And that's the way society is organized. People play different roles. They're good at what they do, and we all rely on each other. But if we all have to become an expert in everything that we might come across in life, we just don't have, it's incredibly inefficient, and it's also, from what you're saying, impossible.
It's a complicated debate. Look, I think in the world of medicine, there's no way we're going to go to medical school, but there's no doubt that having some sense of which physicians to trust and where to shop for them and when to get a second opinion probably gives you years of life. So some basic understanding, not being completely clueless, probably very effective. That's my read about financial literacy. I would not try to get people to be super experts, but I think to know that compounding does something I didn't understand before, to know that separating the account from the business and the whole might be helpful, a few simple rules of thumb might be very effective. Beyond that, I'm totally with you. I think when I see intense financial literacy proposed in schools, my feeling is they should be reading Oscar Wilde instead. I just don't think it's the right thing to do.
But Oscar Wilde was very clever about annuities. He had lots of good sayings.
That's why I chose him.
As did Jane Austen. All right, one last question? Anybody with a burning desire to find out about bad psychology?
I'll show you bad psychology
Just
for a minute.
briefly.
I'll give you two or three examples. Here is a hypothetical, and I'll give you a real. Take Pareto optimality. It's a really nice example because, Pareto optimality, we all know, basically says that if there's a state of the world where some of us are better off and nobody is worse off, that's a better place to be. It's logically unassailable. It's beautiful. It just may not be true about dollars or marks or yen or anything else. In other words, there's a lot of data suggesting that if I gave this half of the room a 2% raise and this equally meritorious half a 100% raise, well-being in this room might have gone down. Which means, Pareto is not wrong, of course, it's just not about dollars. And this is, if you think about GDP versus inequality, and we have more and more data suggesting this, if you're measuring how many dollars people are making and not the inequality, you might just be making society less happy while you think it's getting better. And that's a classic bad psychology. We think psychology is about how much money I take home, and it may be how much money I take home and how I compare to others in ways that weigh on me even more. That's the hypothetical. A real. For many years in the US, there was a two-tier welfare law. It's now been rendered, It violates the freedom to travel. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional for completely different reasons. But for many years, what a two-tier welfare law said, it was if I were a welfare recipient living in Alabama and I moved to California where they pay higher welfare, for the first 12 months of residence in the higher paying state, I was only eligible to the lower paying payments from the place from which I came. Okay, so if you move from a lower to higher paying place, for the first 12 months, you only get the lower payments. Why would you do this? Of course, because those who do these rules sit down and think, okay, all these welfare recipients, they'll go on the web, see where they pay the most, hop on their SUVs and go there, and we have to stop this move to the higher paying states. It's a beautiful example because when this was introduced, there was data that mobility from lower to higher paying states equaled mobility from higher to lower paying states. Because why do a welfare recipient mother of two move? Because she found an apartment, because she has a sister who can help with babysitting, because something happened in her life. She doesn't even know how much they pay. I'll give you 1993 example dollars. When you moved from Mississippi to California, California in 1993 paid you $565, which barely allowed you to survive, and this law made sure you only got $120, which guaranteed your demise. So if you have a policy based on some assumption of what makes people move, and you're wrong, you will have destroyed their lives. That's bad psychology. Last one, because it's more positive. This is a beautiful story, emergency rooms in Ontario, Canada. There's a big problem. The homeless hang out in the emergency rooms in big numbers. It makes the emergency room not a pleasant place to be. What's happening? For a while, and this is a nice example because the doctors and the nurses clearly have good intentions. The assumption is it's cold outside and we're giving them a cup of tea. We have to stop being nice because they'll just never leave and come in droves. Dr. Redelmeyer, who's a wonderful physician, and some others based on some interviews, had a suspicion, so they ran the randomized controlled trial, where when the homeless came in, half of them were assigned to the standard condition, as always. The other half got a compassionate treatment. They had an intern attached to them, taking warm and fuzzy care of them, asking what they can do to help them, etc. What they found very clearly is that those who got compassionate treatment were less likely to come back to this or any other hospital in the province. Turns out, when you're homeless and you have a non-life-threatening illness, like a knee that hurts, if you feel people didn't take you seriously, you come again. If you feel they did all they could for you, you have no interest in coming back to the emergency room. So all this time, these well-intentioned doctors and nurses treated people badly and had them all come back, rather than treat them nicely and never see them again. That's bad psychology. Okay, I'll stop. You don't want to see them all.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you so much, Aldo. It's been a delight. and a
Oh,
great
thank
pleasure.
you.
A small token of
Okay.
honesty.
Thank you.
Leave your mic.
Yes.
Thank you. Great. And the great Sphinx.
I have a research question.
So there may be a couple people that want to speak momentarily, but you're all allowed to go or hang out a few minutes, finish your dinner, finish your wine. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8. Have a great evening.